So, hello. I realize that this may be a little bit unconventional, at least for the lunch and learn sessions that I typically do. I have a conflict for the May 6th lunch and learn. So today it is May 5th. And what I figured I would do rather than canceling the May 6th lunch and learn is to teach a lesson right now, to go through what we typically do on Lunch and Learn, and to instead encourage people to watch that lesson on May 6th, or really whenever you're ready to do so. And you'll get a taste of what we normally do. And having a lesson today, even if we aren't experiencing it all together, better than simply canceling. So I recognize it's not the same thing as having the typical interaction, but I figured that at least let's give this a try. And I'm certainly happy to hear from all of you when and if you watch this, and to uh, comment, to question. And the hope is that when we do meet live again, May 13th, which I fully intend to do, when we meet as a group, then I can address some of those questions or anything you want to talk about. So this is not meant to be the format of Lunch and Learn going forward. This is simply just a one-time thing or something that maybe we'll do occasionally, depending on when I have a challenge with my availability. So I want to greet you with that in mind, and uh, we'll see how this goes. And again, I'll look forward to hearing from you. And if you want to ask questions or add some comments before before our next session, this is my email address, Rabbi Rosenbaum at heskaamuna.org. And so I certainly welcome your comments and questions, etc. I'll try to remember to display this again before the end of the session. So what I'll do is what I typically do on a Lunch and Learn, and I will share the text of the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll go into some details about laws having to do with the reading of the Torah on a weekday. This was something that I was going to talk about last week, or at least I was going to explore some text last week. And the conversation wound up going to questions about Torah reading and preparation, which I think is certainly good. So, was happy to discuss that. I like going on tangents, certainly when they're, uh, you know, uh, when they can help with the topic, when they can add to our knowledge, and even sometimes when they're a little bit off topic. So let's go into Safaria as we normally do. And I'll just do this solo. And you're certainly welcome to comment. And by the way, you can comment also in YouTube, assuming you're watching this right now on YouTube. Uh, you can add some comments or questions in that video, and hopefully I can address that at some point. So we're jumping a little bit to talk about this. We're going to it's section 137. I'll try to make the font nice and big. So let's get into this. So the first thing that we need to talk about is how many verses do we need to read for each aliyah, for each separate reading of the Torah? So again, you got to keep in mind that this is speaking of, as you see here, that this is on a day that three people read, right? And on the day in which you have three readings, we'll get to the whole question of three people reading, what that means. We'll talk about that a little farther down. On a day where there's three aliyot, when there are three Torah readings, we do not read fewer than 10 verses. Meaning, and I think this will get into it a little bit, meaning we don't, and any aliyah has to have at least three verses in it. So we do, at the very least, three readings in which you have at least three verses per reading. And the total in general needs to be at least 10 verses, meaning you have to have at least one of those readings exceed the 3-verse minimum. The explanation that I always remember hearing about that is you don't want to make it seem like you're reading the absolute bare minimum. You don't want to make it seem like we are reluctant to do this. Now, there is an exception to this, which you can probably already see on the screen, but I'll get to that in a moment. So, three aliyot, on days where we have three aliyot, you have to read at least three verses per reading, and the total needs to be, with one exception, needs to be 10 verses total. Now, what days are we reading three aliyot, right? How do we determine how many aliyot we do on a typical at a typical service? The traditional way is as follows. On a typical weekday reading, meaning Monday morning, Thursday morning, and Saturday afternoon, if you have a minyan at any of those services, you do three aliyot, no more, no less. If it's Rosh Chodesh, if it's the beginning of a Jewish month, you read four aliyot, no more, no less. If it is a Yom Tov, we read five aliyot, no more, no less. The caveat being that there is an extra aliyah known as maftir. Maftir being the one blessed by the person doing the haftarah. So it's really 5 plus 1. Now, we're talking about Yom Tov. We're talking about 5 different aliyot. What days of Yom Tov are we speaking of? We're talking about any days of Yom Tov for Sukkot, any days of Yom Tov for Pesach, Passover, any days of Yom Tov of Shavuot, and the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. On Yom Kippur, we read 6 aliyot plus maftir. You get an extra one for Yom Kippur because of the sacredness of the day. Shabbat, this is one of those signs so that we know that Shabbat is really the most important holiday, which we get to experience every week. Shabbat, 7 aliyot plus maftir, and Shabbat is the only day when we can add extra aliyot if we want. We can add, honestly, an unlimited amount of aliyot as long as we're doing at least 3 verses per reading. I've been in services at some synagogues where I'm pretty sure we did 18 or 19 aliyot. And I can talk sometime about what caused this, why you had to have so many different aliyot. It was very long. It was a very long service, but you're allowed to do it on Shabbat. Now, the caveat is also that if any Yom Tov falls on Shabbat, we have to do at least seven readings plus maftir. We're going to experience that this year several times. We're going to experience that on the second day of Shavuot, which will take place this year on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, which I think is May 23rd. I think that's the day, May 23rd. The second day of Shavuot, we're going to have 7 aliyot plus maftir. Because what do you do when you have both Yom Tov and Shabbat? You have to bow toward Shabbat when it comes to how many aliyot we have. Now, for those who are watching from Heska Emunah, and you say, well, wait a second, hold on a second. The contemporary service, you only have 3 aliyot. That is a reflection of some of the differences of the contemporary service, which is a whole other discussion. I'm speaking really of traditional services. So even by myself, I've gone on a tangent here, right? We were talking about weekday Torah readings, and then I just went into Shabbat and holidays and everything like that. So make sure that no matter what, you never feel bad about taking me on a tangent when we're in one of our classes. Never feel bad about it because it's always okay. Um, anyway, so back to the idea of a weekday. 3 aliyot, like I said, every aliyah being at least 3 verses with the idea that you have to do at least 10 verses. Now, the question then, and we're back here on the text that you see on the screen. The frequent short introductory verse, like, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, right? God spoke to Moses saying, which is a verse. That is a complete thought. Does that count as a verse? Yes, it does. It counts toward the 3. So you can have an aliyah of 3 verses in which one of those verses is simply Adonai spoke to Moses and said the following. So that certainly counts. Now, if the topic ends in less than 10 verses, this is when we get to the particular exception. The Torah portion of Amalek, which has only 9 verses, is acceptable. Now, what are we talking about? Exodus chapter 17, beginning with verse 8, talks about the attack of the nation of Amalek on the children of Israel shortly after the Israelites complete the Exodus and are now walking toward freedom. Shortly after this happens, the Amalekites uh, attack. They attack from behind. They attack in what uh, God interprets as the most dastardly way that you can. And because of Amalek's horrendous attack, God commands that we need to blot out the nation of Amalek. Um, this episode is read at the service of the morning of the holiday of Purim. Why do we read this on Purim? Because it's understood that Haman, feel free to boo at this time, Haman, the bad guy of the Purim story, he is an Agagite. Agag is considered to be a descendant of or part of the nation of Amalek, meaning Haman was an Amalekite. Makes sense, right? Amalek, the horrendous enemy of the Israelites. Makes sense that Haman would be a cousin or would be actually part of Amalek. So, because of that, it seems thematically appropriate to read about that story when we are uh, celebrating the holiday of Purim. That episode has 9 verses from beginning to end. That explanation of the attack of Amalek is 9 verses. It's really its own kind of self-contained episode. And I've always understood that it's because of the holiday of Purim. Because it's Purim and, well, we're a little more relaxed on Purim, aren't we? And so, because we're more relaxed on Purim, we make an exception. And we allow for the weekday Torah reading, because Purim's always on a weekday, by the way. It's never on Shabbat. The weekday Torah reading on Purim morning, that's the time where we're allowed to make it 9 verses instead of 10, because we're just a little more relaxed. Okay. So we're starting with that. Now, this next section here, each person does not read less than 3 verses. 2 read 3 each, and 1 reads 4, and whichever one of them it is who reads 4, behold, this one is praiseworthy. Okay. I need to explain something else. And this might go on a little bit of a tangent as well, but it's worthwhile. When you say each person, reading the Aliyah, you might say to yourself, hold on a second. The person who says the blessing for an Aliyah, the one who gets up and goes, Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach, the one who says the blessing, well, they're not often, in most cases, actually, they're not the one actually chanting the Torah portion. Does this mean that everyone who says the blessing should be expected to chant the reading that they are blessing? The way that Torah portions began, the way that public Torah readings began, when this practice started, that was the expectation. It was the expectation that if you were called to the Torah, to have an aliyah, to say the blessings over it, the expectation was you need to read from the Torah at that time. Essentially, at a moment's notice. This assumed a very high level of Hebrew literacy, that someone could get up and chant the Torah without any preparation, and that anyone who participates in the service can do so. What began to happen over time is that as this practice continued, you would find fewer and fewer people prepared to do that. Or people would realize that not a lot of people are able to simply do that, especially on a moment's notice. Or even if you prearrange, okay, hey, when we have a service next Monday, you're gonna have the third Aliyah, so make sure you're ready to chant that, to say the blessings and chant that. You're gonna have the second Aliyah, make sure you can say the blessings and chant that, etc. Even then, not everybody had that ability. And you ran the risk of having the same people over and over again participating in the Torah service, and everybody else just watching. It became not a very participatory thing. And then in some circumstances, if the idea was you have 3 readers, 3 aliyot, and therefore 3 different readers, well, in some circumstances, you couldn't even find 3. And then think about what I talked about in terms of other days, right? Shabbat, you would need 7 plus maftir. You would need 8 different people who could all come up and do a reading. Some communities just didn't have that. And so the system was devised, the system was adjusted to make it so that a Torah reader could read for somebody else's aliyah. Meaning, Shlomo is prepared to do the Torah, to do this Torah reading. But Yankel over here, who isn't prepared but can get up and say the blessings, Yankel can come up and Shlomo will read in Yankel's place. And in that scenario, Shlomo can do multiple readings, right? Potentially, if Shlomo's a really good Torah reader and or really knows the entirety of the Torah reading for that day, hey, he can read for everybody who comes up to say the blessings. So that's how this separation happened, where you have Torah readers and people who have aliyot to the Torah, and people who simply come up to say the blessings. It allows for greater participation, and it also allows for people who maybe we didn't necessarily expect to be at services that day. Hey, would you like to participate in the Torah service? Would you like an aliyah? Would you like to be able to say the blessings? And they can accept and participate without the pressure of having to just chant a reading that they had no idea that they were going to chant. With all of that said, though, it is ideal for the person who is called to the Torah to say the blessings. It is still ideal for that person to do that reading if they can. The ideal is to be able to read for yourself. So I'll give an example. As a lot of you know, my daughter celebrated her bat mitzvah. At this point, it was almost a year ago, which feels kind of surreal. And we had a number of different Torah readers. We wanted to get a lot of different participation. Whenever I could, I would try to make it so that the reader was also the person saying the blessing. Now, in this congregation, we do allow for couples or two people to come up to say a blessing together. So, for instance, my father prepared a Torah reading. And so I arranged for the ones who are to say the blessing, for that to be my father and his wife, my stepmother. My mother prepared a Torah reading. I arranged it so that the people who were called up to say the blessings would be her and her husband, my stepfather. That's the ideal. To be able to say the blessings for your own Torah reading, if possible. It's not always possible, and it's not the end of the world if you don't do it. But it is a nice thing, if you can. And every once in a while, you'll see this where somebody who is called up to the Torah happens to be somebody who is incredibly well versed, no pun intended, in Torah reading. And hey, would you like to have the third Aliyah? Sure. Would you like me to read it too? Then usually whoever prepared the reading will say, sure, if you like. If you feel like you can do it, sure, go for it. So that does happen every so often. That is still the ideal. So whenever we see in these texts the idea that each person reads, in other words, there was still an assumption or a hope in the Shulchan Aruch at that time in this text that the person saying the blessings over the Torah is also reading. That's still the ideal that they are pushing, that they are advising. It wasn't always the case, and it often was not the case, even in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, but they're still nudging for that ideal. Okay, so that's a lot about how we went from a system in which the person being called to the Torah had to do the reading to not necessarily, but that's still the assumption that they work from. Okay, that's plenty of that. Now, part 3 of this section of the Shulchan Aruch. If one skipped a verse and didn't read it, if it was Mincha on Shabbat, the afternoon service of Shabbat, or a Monday and Thursday, and they read 10 verses besides the skipped verse, they do not need to go back and repeat the reading. But if not, then they must go back. So this will happen every once in a while. You'll goof, right? You'll stop a reading. You'll the Torah reader stops a verse too early, and for whatever reason the Gabbis don't quite catch it. It does happen. In fact, actually, I was reading Torah in Charleston this past Saturday, and it actually happened before a Torah reading that I did for that synagogue. Um, the previous reader stopped one verse before she was supposed to, and the Gabbis didn't correct them. It happens. So I came up and I took a look at the verse, and it was a very, for me, a pretty simple verse that I just was able to figure out in a moment. And so when that happened, I just began my reading one verse early and went into that. Again, not ideal, but I was able to make it so that all the verse, that verse did not go unread. The scenario we're talking about here is that you have a weekday reading. Some weekday readings are the minimal amount, the 10 verses. But a lot of weekday readings are actually more. So let's say you have a weekday reading where the total number of verses is 12. And somebody forgot to read one of the verses. And that meant that 11 verses were read. So the Shulchan Aruch is saying in that scenario, okay, well, at least we did the 10 verse minimum. We're still okay. You don't have to go back and do it over again. You're still not supposed to skip it. It's not that it's okay to just skip it and, forget about it. But if it happens, you don't have to rectify it. However, if it's a 10 verse reading and you skipped a verse and now it meant that you only read 9 verses for the total reading, yeah, you got to go back and rectify that. Okay. Now, if it was the Shabbat morning reading, now maybe this is the example I didn't realize that we were going to go into this example. Then even if he skipped one verse, he must go back and read again. So that's what I wound up doing. Even if they already returned the Torah to the Ark and they said Kaddish, they basically started the Musaf service, and they said the Chatzi Kaddish. He must go back and read the skipped verses and at least 2 others. Meaning, if they realize that if it's a Shabbat and you realize a little bit later, oh my gosh, did we not read one of those verses? We're supposed to take the Torah back out, open it up again, and not only read the skipped verse, but read a couple of others so that you're still doing that minimal 3 verse reading. I've never seen that happen, but this is what they're advising here. Even if they already read the Haftorah, the reading from the prophets, and prayed Musaf, he must go back and read again. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine a Shabbat morning where we've read, like, services are basically done? We're doing announcements. We're about to do Adon Olam. Kiddush is waiting. We're about to, have lunch. And then somebody says, hey, we forgot to do a reading. We forgot to read one of the verses. According to the Shulchan Aruch, You got to drop what you're doing, open the ark, take the Torah out, and have someone read the verse that you missed plus two others. Can you imagine that happening? I don't think it'd be the end of the world. It wouldn't be the worst thing ever, but it might be something where people might say, really? Do we have to? Um, I've never seen that happen. Um, but in theory, I guess that's what you would need to do. That's how seriously that we take the reading of the Torah. I mean, that this is something that is kind of all. This is just something that is behind all of this. That obviously reading the Torah is sacred, and that sacredness means that if you miss a verse on Shabbat, you can't just go on. All of these words are sweet. And I think, and now you might be saying to yourself, okay, but all right, if it's so important to do it on Shabbat, why wouldn't it be important on a weekday? I think the difference has to do with not so much that Shabbat is more important, but you also got to think about the timing here. A weekday morning service, usually you got a bunch of other things to do that day. A Shabbat morning service, the idea is it's Shabbat. What else are we doing? What else do we have to do? What else do we have to do, right? I mean, now obviously we want to have Kiddush. I mean, I'm not trying to minimize the importance or enjoyment of Kiddush, but is it really the end of the world if services end at 12:05 as opposed to 12? That's the argument they give. Whereas if it's a weekday morning minyan, let's say, you finish a weekday morning minyan at 8:30 in the morning and you've got a 9 a.m. appointment and you need to bust out of there to get to your 9 a.m. appointment. Well, it's during the week, right? We need to work. We need to go about our typical activities. Shabbat, 12:05 as opposed to 12, not the end of the world. Anyway, it still feels like it would be a pain in the neck if it came to that. Again, I've never experienced that. And then we go on to say the Torah readings on the festivals, their laws on this are similar to Shabbat, Mincha, Monday, and Thursday, since they already read those readings on their respective Shabbat. Okay, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And that's another reason I didn't think about. Over the course of the year, as you're probably aware, traditionally at least, for those who do a full Torah reading on Shabbat, if you read the full portion on Shabbat, over the course of the year, every word of the Torah is read. If you're doing a triennial reading every Shabbat, every verse of the Torah is read on Shabbat over the course of 3 years. Torah readings for a weekday and for a major holiday are readings also included in the weekly Torah portion. So we're not as strict about making up for a verse that we may have forgotten to read on a festival, because we will get to it on a Shabbat during that Torah reading cycle. Let me give a more concrete example. Hopefully that will make some sense. Um, okay, Rosh Hashanah. First day of Rosh Hashanah, the reading of the Torah is the main reading, not the maftir, but the main reading is the entirety of Genesis chapter 21. So what happens if the Torah reader forgets to read Genesis chapter 21, verse 5? Again, look, not ideal. I mean, it's not like we can just skip whatever we feel like. But but if then you realize it way later in the service, oh, we forgot to read that. You don't have to go back and take out the Torah again, because the thought is, well, that verse is part of the Torah portion of Vayera. We're going to read that verse in the regular Torah reading cycle. So it's not the end of the world if we don't, we don't have to fall all over ourselves in order to um, make sure that we make up and say that verse again. So, so the justification they're giving here is not so much that of time, but rather the idea of the regular Torah reading cycle takes a certain amount of that covers for these kinds of uh, mistakes. That's the reason given here. Okay. This next section. If one person read only 2 verses, he needs to go back and read again. Okay, so in other words, this 3-verse minimum for any one individual reading, we got to hold by that, right? And if they only read 2 verses, you gotta finish it. And if they only read 9 verses between the 3 of them, 3 for each of them, there is no need for them to go back and read again. And the proof for this is the portion of Amalek which only has 9 verses. But if they read less than 9 between them, they need to go back and read again. I feel like we already covered that. I don't know why we had to go back to that, but okay. Okay. Maybe there's something, and listen, maybe there's something I'm missing with any of this. So feel free to, in your comments or questions, point out anything I might miss. Okay. This has to do with a very specific reading. If one read the Parsha of Parah and stopped at the end of the 10th verse, which concludes with the words Hager Hagar Betocham, which means who lives among them, and rolled up the Torah scroll, you must go back, open it again, and start reading from the beginning of the portion until the verse which concludes with the words Ma'ad Ha'arev shall be ritually unclean until the evening, and he must make the blessing before and after it. So the Parsha of Parah, you may be aware that there are several Shabbatot that take place in the weeks leading up to the beginning of the holiday of Passover. in which there is a special Maftir Torah reading, um, having to do mainly with the approach of Passover. One of them is what's known as Shabbat Parah, which has a very inelegant name. Shabbat Parah literally means the Sabbath of the cow. Nothing against cows, but maybe not the most elegant of animals. Anyhow, what is Shabbat Parah? It refers to Numbers. The special reading for Shabbat Parah is Numbers chapter 19, verses 1 through 22. Shabbat Parah takes place a few weeks before Passover begins, because the contents of this reading refers to the purity of the community following a tragedy. And the idea is that we are to be, or our ancestors were to be ritually pure. They had to be ritually pure in order to eat of the Passover sacrifice, which was, in terms of participation in the Passover holiday, was like that was one of the big things you had to do. You had to be ritually pure for that. So there would be a Shabbat leading up to Passover that we still do, that was meant to address the matters of purity. So on that Shabbat, we read that section as the Maftir Torah reading. There's also a special Haftarah. There's also a special prophetic reading. And they say specifically for this is one reading where if you goof and you stop it early, you got to go back again and do it. I mean, this has to be read because the community needs to hear these words. I find it interesting that they single out the Maftir reading for Shabbat Parah as opposed to some of the other special Maftir readings of the weeks leading up to Passover. Maybe they'll cover it, but I kind of find that interesting. Okay. One who read from the Torah first, and the second reader read what the first had already read. Meaning, if the second reader went back and read what the first reader did, if he added 3 verses to what was already read by the first, or even 2 verses in a place where it was not possible to add 3, the second is included in the count of valid aliyot. But if not, he is not included in the count except for the reading of the portion of the bowls of Chol HaMoed Sukkot, because there is no possibility of adding additional verses. I don't have much to say about this. I think that maybe a little, this may be kind of like getting into some Picayune stuff. I'll just leave it at this. If you want me to go into this in an upcoming session, I'm happy to dive into it more, but this doesn't seem to be earth-shattering to me. But if it's important to you, happy to revisit it. I am trying to make this recording about an hour, about the amount of time you'd have for lunch and learn. So let's see what we can do over these next 10 minutes or so. This is to not leave over less than 3 verses in a portion, in a reading. So this is a one, there's like really one thing that they have for this. So let's see what they got on this. Yeah, maybe we'll do this and be done after that. The one who reads from the Torah may not leave over any less than 3 verses in a paragraph. Because we are concerned for those who leave the synagogue, then, that they will say that the reader after him will only read the 2 remaining verses of the paragraph. And similarly, one may not begin less than 3 verses into a paragraph, because of those who enter the synagogue, then they will say that the first reader only read 2 verses. So this literally has to do, when you're talking about a paragraph, you're talking about literally a paragraph of Torah, because there are, if you look in the Torah scroll, there are paragraph breaks. And so the idea is, when it comes to dividing up the readings, maybe the subject matter might end a verse or two before the end of a paragraph, but you might as well just finish the paragraph. Because let's say somebody walks out of the room at that point, and they'll say, "Oh, you know what? They stopped a couple verses only a couple verses before the end of the paragraph. The next person must only be reading 2 verses. What's up with that?" So we are concerning ourselves with the appearance that we may be skirting these regulations. This is an example, and I'm going to try not to talk at too great a length about this, but we've talked at different times, I think, about the concept of Ma'arit Ayin. The idea of, and this is a general category of Jewish law, that we do certain things because if we didn't, it might not look great. Should we be so worried about how everything looks all the time? No. However, there is a reality that perception does color the way that people think about others, about the community, about individual people. And so sometimes we can do certain things in order to ensure that our intentions and our actions are crystal clear to anyone who might think otherwise. So an example of this is an example I like to point to. Let's say you're at a kosher function that is in which the meal that is served is a meat meal, and then they're serving coffee. Well, a lot of people like cream in their coffee. I'm told. I'm not a coffee drinker. A lot of people like cream in their coffee. Well, you can't have dairy cream if you're having a kosher function and serving meat. But as we know, there is such thing as non-dairy creamer. even in a circumstance in which everything is served in, fancy finery, the non-dairy creamer needs to be offered in its original container, which might look a little bit off when everything else we're pouring from comes from these, nice silver or glass vessels or something like that. We have to put out the carton of non-dairy creamer because it needs to be absolutely clear to everyone that this is non-dairy creamer. Because if you just poured the non-dairy creamer into the fancy vessel, you might take a look at that and say, "What? We're mixing milk and meat? What's this about?" You have to have the original container because of Mari-Dai. Even when you're doing everything right, you don't want to make it seem like you're not doing the right thing. So that's Mari-Dai. Okay. Now we have a gloss on this one from the Ramah, and there is no difference between an open paragraph and a closed paragraph. A paragraph that only has two verses is permitted to leave over these two verses at the beginning of a paragraph and to stop there. One should aim to always begin to read on a good matter and to end on a good matter. Now, I'll focus on this and then we'll go. Ideally, the way that Torah readings are split, the ideal is to do it by subject matter, but sometimes an aliyah, a particular reading will end like right, start and stop right in the middle of a story. But as we know, there are some stories in the Hebrew Bible that are, where the subject matter is pretty grim. And to stop on a bad note is something we try not to do. So every once in a while, there'll be a story that's a particularly difficult story, but in the middle of it, someone says something like, "Praise be to God." That's the point where we break the story. That's the point that we break up the aliyah. Because at least we're not ending it with something really negative or sad or harrowing or what have you. So all of that needs to be considered when we divide up our Torah readings. So why don't we finish it here? And again, you may be watching this on Wednesday at the normal time. You may be watching it later, however many days later. Whatever it is, again, this isn't something I'm going to normally do to pre-record Lunch and Learn, but in a pinch, sometimes maybe this is a good option every once in a while. So a friendly reminder that if you want to comment or ask me a question or what have you, here once again is my email address, so you can feel free to utilize that. And and then there may be an opportunity to talk about some of those things when we meet again as a group live on May 13th. I hope that whenever you watch this, you're having a good day, and I look forward to seeing everyone soon. All right. Take care, and we'll catch you at next Lunch and Learn.